The world is watching international troops pulling out of Afghanistan and the unfolding desperation of locals left behind in horror. The image of Afghan people clinging to a plane taxiing down the runway in Kabul says it all. And while the Taliban say they're not out for revenge, their track record of violently suppressing the rights of women and girls and those who don't conform to their extremist views is chilling. I'm joined now by Dr. Greg Mills of the Brenthurst Foundation. He served as an advisor to ISAF, that's the International Security Assistance Force, for 6 years. So he's been to Afghanistan many times. Good evening, Dr. Mills. And your most recent visit to Afghanistan was just, I think, last month with the former Nigerian President Olusegun Obasanjo. What did you find in Afghanistan at that time, and what did you understand about where the country was at?
So yes, in fact, I've been there. Good evening, Sally. I've been there twice this year. Once in February to complete the writing of a book on international interventions, on donor strategies, which is called Expensive Poverty. So you can probably guess where I'm coming from. And then back there in June and July to work with President Obasanjo in trying to bring about a wider understanding of what it takes to make peace. He, of course, has tremendous experience in this regard and great wisdom, and to share it with the Afghans, and we produced subsequently a documentary in this regard. But the feeling in Kabul, even in February, but certainly in June, July, was a little bit Alamo-esque. You know, you felt like the ring was closing in on you all the time, that there didn't seem to be a way out. And I think, of course, a lot of this was created by the announcement of the American withdrawal, and then the expediting of this withdrawal. And I think a lot of Afghans panicked. And then that happened simultaneously with, of course, the surge in Taliban activity, this different strategy that they had of cutting off Kabul from its northern supply routes, which was quite contrary to what they'd done in the past. And then the tremendous attrition faced by the Afghan National Army, compounded by desertions, compounded by infighting within the government, which led to this sort of high-speed Saigon-like collapse. You know, and on Saturday did you have the president saying, we're going to consolidate our armed forces, and on Sunday he departed. So I think extraordinary by even the standards of the 1970s, and quite a lot faster than all the intelligence services of the outside world, including the Americans, had ever predicted or in fact had wanted to see.
Prior to your visits this year, you'd been in Afghanistan many times as part of ISAF, which is the International Security Assistance Force. Given what you know of the Taliban through those many visits, when they say that they've changed, that they're not out for revenge, do you believe them?
Checks in the mail, I think, is the answer to that one. I mean, obviously, they realize that their international legitimacy and thus their access to international funding, whether it be investment funding or donor funding, humanitarian support, is to a great extent dependent on what they do and how they go about doing it. Obviously, they're preaching a moderate tune at the moment, but the picture is very varied coming out of Afghanistan. The UN Secretary General has already pointed out mass incidences of human rights violations. There's a very mixed picture in terms of Taliban attitudes towards women once more. Remember that in 2000 or 2001, there were just 900,000 kids in school. Today, there are 10 million. One wonders whether you're going to see that go backwards and women be forced to remain at the home and be fully burqa'd and covered. You know, they say they won't do that. They say that women will be allowed to go to work. They will be allowed to leave home, not in the presence of a man, as was the case in the 5 years of their rule from 96 onwards. I think we'll have to wait and see. And I think that the problem here is that the Taliban is many different things. It's a franchise operation. It's not just one thing, and there are many different elements to it. There's some radical elements. There's some warlord elements. There's some ultra-nationalistic, revanchist elements. We'll have to see which one actually is in the palm seats in Kabul ultimately.
So the US President Joe Biden has been severely criticized about this withdrawal. He says in his defense it was always going to be difficult to withdraw from Afghanistan, and that the forces they trained should have done a better job in holding off the Taliban. Do you think that's a fair criticism he's making?
I think it's a fair criticism in terms of the amount of money that they poured into Afghanistan, but they always knew that a large percentage of that money was being wasted, which is why it was required in Afghanistan in the first instance. I mean, that's why donors give money, because they know it's going to be wasted. And they knew about the corruption. They knew that there were large ghost elements in the Afghan National Army and police and intelligence services. They knew the rate of attrition. They also mapped out a strategy for them, which essentially had these 200-odd bases spread countrywide, which had to be supplied by helicopter. And when the helicopters went away and when the support for the helicopters went away, it became extremely difficult for the ANA to do this. And this led to the sort of cascading, snowballing effect and deteriorating morale and knowledge that there was end of support, the attempts to try and give maintenance support to helicopters by Zoom. It's difficult enough doing an interview by Zoom, trying to do maintenance support for a helicopter by Zoom. All of this cascaded in the way in which we've seen unfold. And of course, once morale has been damaged, it's very hard to put that back together again. And of course, a lot of the localized elements made deals with the Taliban. They didn't support necessarily the government of Ashraf Ghani, who was unpopular or had very limited popularity. And they would support whoever would provide their safety and security and means of income. And this is what's happened over the last 3 months. So it's very much, there's a title of that book which says, Afghanistan, where God only comes to weep. And we are seeing, unfortunately, another flood of tears.
The USA and its allies entered Afghanistan to wipe out terrorism after the 9/11 attacks nearly 20 years ago. Clearly that has failed. You talk about the need for local solutions, that it's not about the massive hardware, but it's about small, sustainable solutions. And that can be a lesson for everyone who's dealing with extremists and considering how to deal with the problems. You've mentioned one of the mistakes that the USA has made, but what are the other key mistakes that have been made and the lessons that we need to learn?
Well, there have been lots of mistakes made. I mean, trying to build a sort of almost a first world army in the circumstances of Afghanistan. But probably and I'll just disagree with you, if I may, Sally. I think from a very narrow American perspective, Afghanistan hasn't been used as a base for international terrorism or terrorist attacks against the United States or its allies over the last 20 years. From that very limited definition, they've been successful. From a broader definition about nation building, state building, governance, of course, they've been very unsuccessful, wholly unsuccessful, as it turned out. But one of the things that President Obasanjo reminded me of is to make peace, you need three components. You need the international community, and particularly the region, which they don't have, pushing the parties to the negotiating table. And in this case, you've got each of the regional countries, India, Pakistan, Iran, the Stans, China, all having their own different agendas at different times. So you need them to push the Taliban, in this instance, and the government to the negotiating table. You also need the conflicting parties, second, to realize that there's more to be gained by ending fighting than continuing with it. This is what we had in South Africa, fundamentally, in the early 1990s. And the Taliban, of course, were resurgent. And so they didn't want to negotiate in these circumstances. And then, of course, you need leadership and timing. Yeah. And this is fundamentally a failure of politics. They should have negotiated with the Taliban early on and filled with hubris and the post-9/11 zeal. America didn't want to do that in the early 2000s.
Try and find a solution. I have to ask you one last question. Sorry to jump in, because I want to bring it much closer to home.
No problem.
And could the Taliban's capture of Afghanistan embolden extremist groups in areas such as Mozambique's Cabo Delgado? And if so, what's the big lesson that as a region we need to learn about dealing with these groups?
Well, the big lesson is what I was going to end with, which is to say that the cause of war is the failure of politics, and the solution to war is political. Very Clausewitzian. So you need to understand the root causes of conflict. There's no point in trying to bring about a military solution in Mozambique if the problems are really developmental and political. You're simply just putting a cork in the bottle, but it's going to overspill at some point. And I think your first part of your question, which is about the sort of franchising effect of radicalism? Well, it depends to an extent what the Taliban turns out to be in version 2.0. If they look like they're Taliban 1.0, I think there will be a radical surgence in Africa, an emulatory type effect. But one would hope that they will preach a more moderate line. And I think it will then behove countries that are facing the problems like Mozambique is to understand what the root causes are: education, development, wealth creation, and so on, and address those.
Thank you so much for chatting to us this evening. Fascinating insights from Dr. Greg Mills of the Brenthurst Foundation. He served as an advisor to ISAF, which is the International Security Assistance Force, for 6 years, travelling to Afghanistan, also in Afghanistan earlier this year as well.